The Chamber of Commerce in Springfield, Missouri, as it is in most cities, is comprised of business owners and employers and some salespeople who band together in the hopes of fostering a more successful business environment. About 20 years ago, the Chamber asked their members to respond to a questionnaire about what they need out of the economic environment of this community that they're having difficulty finding, specifically in terms of hiring. What do they need out of the labor pool that's not available to them now? What emerged out of that was the most amazingly blind program that reeked of classism and entitlement thinking that could only happen in an unquestioned, economically tiered society. It was asking the aristocracy, what do you think about the revolting peasants? You know, the peasants are revolting, but, whatever. What these employers said that they needed was more depth of character out of their employees. So the Chamber came up with a list of 12 qualities that they wanted to partner with our education system so that the education system, the school system, would inculcate these 12 virtues into their future servants. The proposal read like a wish list of slave owners describing what they wanted from their slaves. The 12 character strengths the employers wanted included such things as attitude, which meant that they wanted their employees to come to work and be cheerful and friendly in spite of miserable working conditions, low salaries, and tedious jobs. They wanted them to be dependable, which meant that they would show up for work on time, ready to work, and willing to passively cooperate with erratic work schedules. Like, most minimum wage workers don't get 40 hours a week. They work for a fast food industry that wants them to come in for 2 hours during the noon rush, then take 3 or 4 hours off and come back to work and work 2 more hours in the evening dinner rush, but doesn't actually pay them anything for all the time that they're just sitting around and waiting for a chance to make a little more money. They wanted their workforce to be loyal, that is, to praise their masters, even when to do so required fundamental dishonesty. But they also listed honesty because they wanted their employees to not steal from the employers, even where some of those employers required their employees to work off the clock. One of the issues in both fast food and at Walmart is that employees are pressed to get a certain amount of work done that can't be done in the hours they're being paid for, so they are literally being stolen from by their employer day after day after day. But if one of their employees puts something in their pocket, then they're taken out of Walmart in handcuffs as a thief. So I was still a fairly young pastor who was still new in the community when this list came out, and the president of the Chamber of Commerce was a member of the church that I worked for, and he was chair of the personnel committee, which basically gave him the power to set my salary and benefit package based on how much loyalty I showed to him. I'm ashamed to admit that it took me almost 2 years to make this man become a Presbyterian. I eventually convinced him that he needed to leave the church where I worked and become a Presbyterian. But this character ed program, this sort of slave owner teaching slaves how to do song and dance, was also objected to by a fairly large coalition of local churches. That, one of those rare events where churches bound together and rose up and objected in loud protest to the character ed program. But before you start applauding, let me tell you, what united them was the use of the word tolerance. The big churches in town did not want tolerance to be considered a desirable character because tolerance was a code word for no longer being prejudiced against homosexuals. And they were not going to stand for the Chamber of Commerce acting like it wasn't a virtue to persecute homosexuals. Now, I was offended by the Chamber's assumption that the biggest problem with our class society and violent wage disparity was that the poor refused to whistle while they worked. But for my religious peers to hold press conferences and write newspaper editorials decrying tolerance as a character value was an outrage. So in both the newspaper and from the elevated pulpit of the big denominational church where I worked, I thundered against the churches that demanded that the word tolerance be removed from the list. And as usual in such fights in Springfield, Missouri, I lost and they won. The chamber and the school system mutually agreed to remove tolerance and to change it to the word courtesy. Because we Southerners, we know how to mask our racism, our prejudice, and our hatred with just a touch of syrupy courtesy. Will bless their hearts on their way to hell. In the midst of my campaign to keep tolerance on the list, a list whose very existence I had previously protested and found to be morally repugnant. Folks, you got to understand, this job of being a prophet in a conservative town gets very complicated at times. But an elderly retired minister in my church came by the door on his way out of church, and in place of the innocuous good sermon preacher, which is the usual handshake that I get at the door, he raised his finger and poked it right in my face and said, "Tolerance is not a religious value. Tolerance is just a weak, meaningless nothing. Love is a religious value." Prophets don't really like being corrected, especially in public, especially when you're engaged in the full moral outrage against a contemptible power that's forcing oppression on the poor. But that was a correction that has stuck with me through the years. We don't typically think of tolerance as all that noble a character value. We may say of a couple we know of that's been married for years and years in a conflict-riddled marriage that they barely tolerate one another. Or you think if you said to your beloved, "I love you," and they said, "I tolerate you," it's not enough. It's just not enough. Tolerance is better than open warfare, but it's not a goal. It's not a character goal. Let me ask you this. I don't want a show of hands, but for those of you that are here today and those that are listening on the internet, let me just ask, do you personally know someone who has had an abortion? You think about who you know. A lot of you, especially a lot of you that are members of traditional religious families, might think that you don't know someone who's had an abortion. But let me tell you, there's between 1 million and 1.5 million abortions in the United States every year. And since only women can have an abortion, think about that, and only women of childbearing years, that narrows the field so considerably that when you stretch it out over the decades since Roe v. Wade, it becomes mathematically obvious that at least 1 out of every 3 women that you know have had an abortion. So if you know 3 women, you know someone who's had an abortion. And based on my experience, a whole lot of those women want to be able to talk about it. I mean, it's their personal business. They don't have to talk about it. They don't have to tell you. But in my experience, they want to talk about the decision before, and most need to talk about it after. But they want to talk to someone who will not judge them. They want to talk to someone who can listen to them empathetically. That's not to say that they want to talk to someone who is willing to tolerate them. They want to talk to someone who will love them in the midst of a painful and difficult decision. My phone rang one day a couple of years ago, and the woman at the other end of the line was crying so hysterically that it was obvious that she was about to fall all apart. And over the years, it's not been uncommon for women to talk to me about this important decision, but this phone call was different. It wasn't from a church member. It wasn't from someone I knew in town. It was from one of our YouTube listeners who lives 1,000 miles away, someone I'd never met and never will meet, but she wanted me to help her to decide about whether or not she should have an abortion. And I'm glad that she felt like, from listening to sermons online, that I was someone that she could trust. But I had to ask her, do you have a pastor where you live that you could talk to? What about your school counselor? What about your parents? Is there someone in your life that you can trust to love you enough to talk to about this? And I was really concerned about, just giving her my philosophical view about a woman's right to govern her own reproductive life and everything, and then hang up the phone and she's got nobody. And I get that sometimes women want anonymity at a moment like this, and I was a safe choice for an anonymous confidant. But as the father of a daughter of childbearing age, it kind of made me want to go hunt down her father and slap him until his teeth came loose. Because fathers, your daughters should instinctively know that they should be confident beyond any shadow of doubt that in the darkest moments of their life, that you are their hero, that you are their champion, that you are in their corner. And when no one else can be trusted, that they can trust you to love them without fail. And this is something that you can't just tell them. You can't just say, well, you can trust me. They already know whether they can trust you, based on how you talk to them at the dinner table, based on how you read to them at night when they were going to sleep. They know from how you packed their lunch and cleaned the gravel out of their skinned knees, whether you are tolerant or whether you are loving. Our little church meets in a rebuilt and repurposed building that for 40 years was a Jehovah's Witnesses Kingdom Hall. For 40 years, people sat in this room and were taught that if any member of their family, whether it was their mother, their daughter, if they left the Jehovah's Witnesses to either go to another church or to go to no church at all, that you were not to speak to them anymore. You were not to associate with them anymore. You shouldn't have meals with them anymore. You shouldn't show them any approval until they came back into the fold and thought like you thought. Now that's extreme, but over the years that our church has been in existence, we've had any number of members who came to us from the Catholic Church or from the Assemblies of God who in fact kept it a secret where they went to church on Sunday mornings because their family would have engaged in conflict if they'd only found out. And yet we sit and watch the news at night and we think, well, why won't those Israelis and Palestinians get along peacefully? What's wrong with them? We want most of the Middle East to forget about a century of colonial exploitation by the West and just sell us their natural resources at a price where we can take all the profit. Why shouldn't we own the oil companies and refineries that make all of the money off of their natural resources? Tolerance, men and women, will not create the world that we think we want to live in, because tolerance is not enough. Now, I've talked about marriage and family and employee relationships so far, and we started off with this nice verse from the 13th chapter of John in which Jesus tells his disciples to love one another. That, in fact, the definition of what it means to be a Christian is that you give evidence of that through affection for one another. And that is a nice thought. It doesn't describe a lot of what most of us have experienced in churches through the years, but still, wonderful thought, beautiful idea. But even still, it doesn't get to the crux of the matter. When the Jesus Seminar scholars looked at the Gospels with a critical eye, and they tried to make an educated guess as to which of the teachings found in the Gospels actually originated with the historical Jesus, and which parts were added as a product of the later church, the one line that virtually all of the scholars agreed was a teaching that was so radical, so unique, that they all agreed that it must have originated with Jesus. And it may, in fact, have been the teaching that made Jesus stand out against all of the other religious teachers of his era. And that is a line that's found both in the 5th chapter of Matthew and the 6th chapter of Luke, where Jesus says, "Love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you." Man, that sucks. That is so hard to even seriously consider. It's nearly impossible to love the people who hate you. I think it's safe to say that no one does it all the time. The bigger question would be whether anybody ever does it. Does anybody ever rise to that level? In a recent TED Talk, Palestinian-born Aziz Abu Sarah talked about his journey from hate to love. Aziz grew up in a West Bank neighborhood where every morning when his mother packed his lunch, she put a whole onion in his lunch. Not to eat. Not to eat. Palestinian mothers believe that if their children are caught in the street where the Israeli army is firing tear gas, that they can cut an onion in two and hold it to their face, and the tearing will help to get the tear gas out of their eyes and will keep them from fainting in the street. This is how a mother has to think. We all pack lunches for our kids. You didn't have to think about what if they're in the street filled with tear gas. So you have to let yourself get outside of your own skin enough to think about what it's like to grow up in a truly conflict-riddled place. I have no idea whether the technique worked, but it's what mothers told themselves that they could do for their children when they're sending them into a street that's genuinely dangerous. And Aziz was the 7th of 7 children. He talked about how he looked up to his oldest brother, and his oldest brother was more like a parent to him because his parents were tired and busy, and his oldest brother was his hero. And one day the Israeli soldiers came and broke down the door and asked to see everyone's ID, and they captured his brother because he was suspected of having thrown rocks at the Israeli military. And they beat him. They beat him to get a confession out of him that they never got. And when they couldn't get him to confess, they released him, but he was so severely injured, he went to the hospital and he died there. Now, this early childhood trauma wounded Aziz deeply. It hurt him, made him angry, so that as he became older, he did become a violent protester. He did throw rocks at the Jewish occupiers of his land. But at some point, his hate was just eating him alive. And so he said that he tried to figure out why the Israelis were so evil. And he went to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. There's two, actually. There's one for children and one for adults. And I've been to both. And it's hard to walk through there and not become sympathetic to the Jewish people. Even though, I really have strong feelings about how Israel runs Israel. And I'll go on record as believing that it was a mistake to take Middle Eastern property to solve a European sin. I think that the homeland for the Jews should have been created out of German and Polish land. That's what I think. But that isn't how it was done, and 60, 70 years have passed, and this is how it is. So Aziz studied Hebrew, and he studied the Jewish religion. And it's not that he forgave the fact that they murdered his brother. It's not that he could empathize with how, Israel does not have capital punishment. They just kill you while they're arresting you. There is real violence in that part of the world. And most people who visit Israel, you either go with a tour group that's showing you Christian sites, or you go with a tour group that's showing you Muslim sites, and people come away with a confirmation of bias. The first time I went, I was a seminary student, and I was shown all these wonderful places about Jesus and the birth of Judaism and Christianity, and I thought at that point in my life that the Muslims were really just a nuisance, that we needed to be able to tear down the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the temple. And, I was completely sympathetic with the Israelis. Years later, as I began to study what was going on with Palestine and how it all came about, my sympathies became divided. But most tourists that are going to Israel and the West Bank are coming with a predetermined prejudice, and they find all kinds of confirmation for their prejudice. But Aziz joined with two Jewish partners, and they formed a tour group that takes tourists, and they send both a Jewish and a Muslim tour guide, so that every site they go to, they can explain their perspective, because they realized, as Martin Luther King famously verbalized, an eye for an eye ends up with everybody being blind. That there are genuine offenses against the Palestinians, but the Palestinians are not innocent. There's lots of horrible, violent crimes committed on both sides, and it's not working to solve the problem. And what is being proposed typically by the United Nations and by the United States government is tolerance, a two-state solution. The issue is, if they're going to occupy the same piece of real estate, they've got to figure out how to love each other. That's the only real solution. Aziz has decided that if only people can see the two different perspectives at the same time, hold two conflicting ideas in your head at the same time, that's the only chance they have for peace in the future. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote in the Imitatio Christi, the Imitation of Christ, that to fully understand another person is to entirely forgive them. And I think that's true. Our talk about love in religious communities really needs to be more than esoteric verbiage. It can't be just an ideal placed so high, so far above us, that no one ever really tries, that no one ever really aspires to it. John records Jesus saying that we should love one another. Seems like a good idea, and I wish we would try it more often. Matthew and Luke recorded Jesus rolling up his sleeves and getting real with us. You should love your enemies. And that's some hard stuff. Doesn't happen naturally, doesn't happen easily, but I think it's the only way there is for us to all survive in a multicultural society, that we've got to do the hard work of understanding our enemies. It takes time, it takes effort. You're not going to get it from the media. They're never going to explain Islamic fundamentalism to you on the TV news. They're only going to pour gasoline on the fire of your fear and hostility. It takes time to understand people, even when they believe something that to us seems absolutely ridiculous and entirely wrong. You don't have to agree to understand. You need to be the kind of mother whose son will never have to wonder if you will still love him if he comes to you and tells you that he's gay. You need to be the kind of father whose daughter will know that you will be her strongest supporter no matter how she may have messed up. You need to be the kind of Democrat who can patiently listen to a Republican neighbor and then lovingly and patiently explain to them why they're wrong. I didn't tell you I had this all worked out. I'm just saying, you know where I'm going with this. And best of luck to you.
Amen.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.